Hi, everyone. I'm forgetting. Sorry, I couldn't cut off Muhammad Asaf in the middle of the verse, so I had to wait until that part finished. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight, this afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in, the time difference, depending on where you are. We're so happy and grateful that you decided to register and join us for this conference. This conference has been something that we've been thinking about and planning since last year, and so there's an overwhelmingly happy feeling for it to finally be to be starting and to be here with all of you. I want to my name is Abir Sabbar. I work at the Palestinian American Community Center. I'm going to be starting us off today with just some brief welcoming remarks, trying to get to know everyone. And this conference is on Zoom, but we're still going to try to make it as interactive and engaging and personable as possible. If you know anything about PACC and what we do, then you know that we're all about the community, and we want to give this conference just as much of a community feel as we do any other event that you'd be able to join us for in person. So a little bit about PACC, just in case this is the first time that you are exposed to our organization or who we are. PACC is a registered nonprofit organization in Clifton, New Jersey. We are honored to serve the second highest concentration of Palestinians and Arabs in the country. If you have ever visited Patterson or Clifton, New Jersey, you know what we're talking about. If you've been to Main Street, which part of it is now in the works, we're trying to rename part of it to Palestine Way. And that really just speaks to the accomplishments and the strong and important presence that Palestinians have in our area, and what we really are trying to do. And actually one of the plus sides of having a virtual conference is bring that to everyone else across the country and across the world. I always use myself as an example. I'm born and raised in California, but the minute I came to New Jersey and saw this community, I knew that I wanted to be a part of it. Here I am, and I moved and I'm a part of it. The food also definitely sells it. And so this is us just inviting you all in true Palestinian hospitality fashion. If you are ever in the area, if you want to ever visit, if you're craving some really good knefa or some really good Arab food, or if you just want to be around community and have a family feel, please, you're always welcome to join us here in New Jersey, and we'd be happy to host you. We'll all get connected during these 4 days, and we can definitely make it happen. I want to just kind of get us started on behalf of myself, the staff, the board of directors, and the entire PACC community. It's our pleasure and honor to be welcoming you all to PACC's third annual conference. Thank you for joining us. We have people tuning in from around the country, and we want to get to know you. So to start us off, some of you already started, but please tell us if you can put in the chat, if you can just tell us your name, what city and state you're tuning in from, preferred pronouns, and if you're Palestinian, please tell us what city or balad from Palestine you and your family are from. If you're not Palestinian, but you want to share your identity with us also, please feel free to put that in the chat. So I'm just going to give everyone a minute to do so, and I'm going to try to read as many of the Palestinian cities as I can as you all put them in. Originally from Mukhmas. Thank you for joining us from Philly. So. From San Francisco, I was born and raised in Daly City, so San Francisco is home for me. Thanks for joining us. Lima from Lifta, from Aram, originally from Mukhmas and Aram, from Tulmusaya. We have New York City. Thank you for joining us. This is about to be which balad is most represented. This is what this is about to end up happening. Mukhmas, Lifta, Silwad, Jerusalem, Tulmusaya, from Haifa, Al-Quds, and Lifta, from Al-Khalil, Jerusalem, from Florida. Welcome, thanks for joining us. From Yafa, Palm Springs, California. I wish I was there. It's very cold in Jersey today. I wish I was in California right now. From Akka. Thank you all for joining us. If anyone wants to continue putting this in the chat, we have Tulmusaya. I see a lot of Tulmusaya pride here. someone should keep a poll where we have people most tuning in from. Okay, so please continue to put this in the chat if you'd like. We love the Palestinian pride, and we want to, this is also part of us reclaiming and keeping Palestine alive, right? Is by continuing to not just say Palestine, but specify the cities that we know are currently, some of which are currently being under attack, are facing attack by settlers. People are facing evictions and literally risking their lives and putting their lives on the line to keep their homes and their cities alive and to keep them Palestinian and keep their Palestinian names. And so we hope that these 4 days also inspire you to continue showcasing that pride in anything and everything that you do. Just a reminder, I know that, one of the great things about virtual is that we can tune in with cameras off, but we would love to see all of you. It really helps the speakers to have people that they can see and talk to instead of just talking to an empty void. So if you're able and comfortable to, please turn on your cameras. And I'm by now, I'm sure we're all aware of Zoom etiquette, but just a gentle reminder to please stay muted and use the chat and Zoom reactions and functions to engage with us if you'd like to. Please keep engaging with us throughout the talks. We love reactions. We love things in the chat. We're going to keep an eye on all of it. So, again, we want this to be very interactive, so please feel free to do that. We have an amazing 4 days lined up for you. We have scholars, activists, artists, community members, all in conversation together about reclaiming Palestine, resisting Zionist occupation, and staying resilient in the face of oppression. And what makes PACC Conferences unique, and it's the reason that it's always my favorite PACC event, and just, the conference in general, is its uniqueness in having conversations about liberation that bring together people from all different sectors, occupations, and experiences to make this knowledge accessible for everyone. Everyone joining us in this conference has a passion for Palestine, self-determination, and justice that is unmatched. That, when coupled with everyone else as a collective, it fuels a fire that will keep burning until we achieve freedom for all. And before we continue, I want to ask you all to join me in a land acknowledgement, because we cannot rightfully talk about Palestine and Palestinians' right of return without acknowledging the stolen and occupied land that we're on today. And so I personally am speaking to you all from Clifton, New Jersey, which is Lenape-Holking land. And we want to take a moment and acknowledge that Indigenous Native Americans are the original and best caretakers of the land that we're on today, right? But beyond just words, beyond just simply acknowledging this, right? We also want to state we want to say that we're also ready and willing to fight alongside our Indigenous siblings for their self-determination as well, and for their land back as well. And so I'm going to drop this link in the chat, and I'm going to ask you all to just join me and take a second to use this link. Okay, it's in the chat, to look up the Indigenous land you're on right now. And if you're familiar with this link already, it's an awesome tool to really be able to, in the same way that we want to keep Palestinian cities' names alive, in the same way that we want to keep holding on to what we know are the true names of the cities that we and our families are from, right? We want to make sure that we continue to honor the names of the Indigenous cities and lands that were here before this land was also settled on. And beyond that, right, I also want to suggest that you do some research. That you do some research about some of the local organizing and Indigenous communities around you, right? So that's not just something that we're saying, but something that we're actually putting into action. That we're going to not just say that we support Palestinian right of return, right, and land back, but that we're going to support anyone's struggle in their fight to get their land back, and in their fight against settler colonialism. And last summer, and this is kind of where I want to end, is last summer we saw more about Palestine on social media and personal conversations amongst friends and families, and even people on TV, that was so overwhelmingly beautiful and inspiring, but also made us realize how much more education about Palestine is needed, right? So I'm sure, and you all can use the Zoom reaction or chat for this, but how many of us started seeing and hearing people talk about Palestine that have never talked about Palestine before, right? And it was awesome and it was great. And this was the moment that we wanted. But at the same time, there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of misuse of words and lack of correct knowledge, which is okay because everyone starts off at a certain place and we all start off at a certain place. But that all of those conversations and all of that momentum really inspired us to put together this conference that could bring the correct tools and the correct education that we want and that is needed for everybody. And in speaking of last summer, there was also a lot of heartbreak and a lot of frustration, a lot of homes demolished, a lot of people's, families and livelihood being put on the line. And so with that, I also do just want to take a moment, if we all can just take a moment of silence, if you want to call it, a moment to honor all of the people, especially the Palestinian people, not just in the last year, but in the last 70 plus years and the decades of them fighting against occupation and oppression. We want to take a moment to honor them, to thank them, right? And to think about ways that we can follow in their footsteps and keep fighting for a free Palestine. So we're just going to take exactly a minute and think about that. Okay. I also want to use this moment in this time, if anyone does have someone that they lost because of their fight against Israeli occupation, someone that they want to acknowledge and honor, please put their names in the chat so we can all read their names and honor them too. A family member that has inspired your organizing for Palestine, a family member that you might have lost and they're organizing for Palestine. We wanna use this space to honor all of those people as well. So I'll give another just 30 seconds if anyone wants to put anyone they want to honor in the chat. Okay. You feel free to do so at any time. You don't have to right now, but if at any point of the panel of the conference or any of the panels, someone does come to mind that you want to think of and honor, please put them in the chat so we can all do that with you. And with that, it's my pleasure, it's my honor. I am very excited for the way in which we're going to start our very first panel. We're all here to learn and grow with you all, to learn more about Palestine and how we can achieve a free Palestine, as we say in protest. Again, just on behalf of everyone at PACC, thank you for joining us. And right now, I want to hand it off to our first moderator of the night to start us off, Nadia Taha. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Abir. Ahlan wa sahlan, everyone. Hello and welcome. I'm Nadia Taha, and I'm a big fan of PACC's work. So I'm quite pleased to be joining you today as a moderator. I'll be presenting a conversation on reclaiming Palestinian history. And this is a discussion that will take us through an authentic and accurate historical analysis of Palestine, the land, the people, and the nation. So given that we are a community of people who have to constantly fight against the disregard and erasure of our history, and given that the intent, if not the actual words of our occupiers, is that the old will die and the young will forget, you've probably heard that. I hope that this conversation will affirm how important it is that we remember and share our history for subsequent generations and to honor our ancestors. Joining us today is Dr. Shireen Saikali. Dr. Saikali is an associate professor of history at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She's the author of Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine. In her forthcoming book, which is called From Baltimore to Beirut on the Question of Palestine, Dr. Saikali charts the trajectory of her great-grandfather's life from 19th century mobility in Baltimore and Sudan to 20th century immobility in Lebanon. The path he was on places the question of Palestine in a global context of race, capital, slavery, and dispossession. Dr. Sekeli is also co-editor of both the Journal of Palestine Studies and Jadaliyya. Dr. Sekeli is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and we'll leave another 10 minutes or so for your questions. Please feel free to type your questions directly into the chat box at any time, and then towards the end of the session, we will go through them in order and try to address all of them. That being said, let's welcome Dr. Sekeli.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that generous introduction, and I'm so honored to be here with all of you. And if it's okay, I have some images to share. Is that fine with everybody? Okay, I think I have, yeah. And my hope is I've timed this talk. I hope that it's actually 31 minutes so that we get a chance to speak to one another. And the images here are important. So if they disappear or I do them wrong, please let me know. As I said, I'm so honored to be here with you all, and I'm longing for the day when we can do this and be touching each other and eating together and breaking bread. But I also am very grateful to have this time together here. Okay. I'm a child of a Palestinian woman and man who became refugees in 1948. And in that sense, like many of us on the call today, I am both a product of and a scholar of our ongoing Nakba, a catastrophe that continues to deny us our political rights. As time passes, I've really come to understand how is it that our history and our memory of it and how we tell it are all really crucial to hold ground. I think history is a very important way for us not just to insist on our peoplehood, but to continue nourishing and enriching it. If you just give me a minute, I'm having a hard time with something. Malish. Okay. So what I'm going to do with you today is share some thoughts on some really personal papers, family papers of mine, a love letter, a passport, a death certificate. And through these documents, I want to reflect together about both the power and the responsibility of history. So I'm starting here with a love letter that came into my life some months ago. I'm going to read it out to you. My dear, I have been thinking a lot about you this week and about our love. I was surprised to find how it engaged all my time and thoughts. Darling, I was miserable on Monday when I could scarcely understand what you talked with me, and I hoped so much to hear from you and talk to you. I'm doing nothing here. I only eat and sleep. I feel rather idle, and I'm not inclined to study. I wonder if the papers will come. My days here are rather empty, and I am rather bored with it. Some of my friends have invited me, but not all yet. Lily Jamil phoned me yesterday, and she might come to me today. How are you spending your time, I wonder? Did you leave Tul Karim already? By the way, darling, I was so excited when I talked with you that I forgot the number of the PO box which you gave me. Was it 1508 or 1805? So darling, I'm going to send it to your office this time. I'm impatiently waiting for Saturday when I hope to see you, sweetheart. I wish you could come with mother. I think she is returning on Saturday. Dear, give my love to Auntie and the rest of the family, and accept for yourself my best love and hottest, most burning desire. Eternally yours, May. May writes here to the love of her life, Ibrahim, who would become her spouse and the father of her 5 children. but that outcome is not yet tangible in this letter. Here she is a student, a young woman in her 20s, surprised at her preoccupation with love, how it captures her moments. That Monday she describes, we don't know which Monday, which month of which year, was full of uncertainty and fear that she marks with the word miserable. She had anticipated hearing his voice, knowing his whereabouts, testing his love, but the disembodied voice was muffled and distant, indecipherable. She is left emptier than ever. Her days revolve around eating and sleeping, depleted of the will to study and experimenting with doing nothing to stave off restless anticipation. She awaits distraction from friends that don't call. Ibrahim, for his part, is somewhere between Tulqarim and his office in Acre. His whereabouts, like the number of the P.O. box she can't remember, are just out of reach. My grandmother was the most soft-spoken woman I've ever met. But here, she is bold, unassuming, articulating her desires fearlessly. What papers were they waiting for? What did Ibrahim do in Tulqarim? Did he love her as much as she loved him? May was born in 1923 in the coastal city of Haifa. She was among the vanguard of young women who received their teaching diplomas at the Jerusalem Girls' College. She loved poetry, and she forged an intimate relationship to Arabic and English. She would become the best sort of teacher, the kind that is always eager to learn. In 1948, May and Ibrahim and their two eldest daughters were, like many others, uprooted from their home and land. With a few scattered belongings and no clear sense of the future, she and Ibrahim built and nourished a tightly knit family in the Beirut neighborhood of Mar Ilyas. They forged happiness despite the loss. Each of their 5 sons and daughters recount their youth as a precious time, neither of instability nor of displacement, but of laughter, joy, and togetherness. May loved Ibrahim so deeply that on a spring evening in 1963, when a heart attack ravaged his 49-year-old body, she held him for hours, weeping, quietly bidding farewell to that burning desire she wrote about here. He would visit her in her dreams until her death in 2009. This letter entered my life a few months ago in a sad ceremony that I now read as a changing of the guards. The family archivist, my maternal aunt Lemia, was shedding her role, closing her home to move in with her brother. I knew Lemia had more that she was holding on to. Ever since a few years ago, she accidentally shared a file of family papers with me. At that time, in 2016, a seance of sorts had taken shape. And my great-grandfather, Naim Qutran, was revealed to me as my guardian and companion. I wrote a book about him without knowing it. And today he is in many persistent and surprising ways challenging me to escape the colonial and national ways of thinking that I have been confined to. His journeys in Baltimore, Sudan, Palestine, and Lebanon are the focus of my work now, as Nadia very generously mentioned. And he has really a number of different kinds of subjectivities or identities. He's a medical doctor, he's a colonial official, he's a slaveholder, he's a landholder, and he's a dispossessed refugee. And so all of these different ways of being in the world are today both my puzzle and my gift. And I want to just show you really quickly here. I'm not going to talk too much about my great-grandfather. I'm just going to give you some snippets of that story, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the discussion. But here you see my great-grandfather, Naim Qutran, in this photograph. And here the year is 1916. And Naim is wearing a pith helmet. And he is sitting here sort of confident in his civilizational and racial superiority. And you see two Black Sudanese men kind of standing at attention at a discreet distance away from him. One wears a turban, the other a fez. Here, Naim is really confident in his role as a junior partner and a medical official in the British and Egyptian rule of Sudan. So here he is really inhabiting this kind of colonial temporality or a colonial understanding of time where Western civilization is really advancing through conquest. So while Naim was in Sudan, and there's a very interesting story about who was in Sudan at the time, it's mostly Syrian Christian doctors, Syrian meaning Greater Syrian. Again, I'd be happy to talk more about that if people are interested. But what's interesting just to think with for us today is how here in Sudan, he's kind of occupying this position of a quote unquote superior doctor, even though a kind of junior partner, a second tier, not as superior as the British, right? But here he's kind of mediating and healing the quote unquote backward natives of Sudan. What's really interesting for Naim is when he returns to Palestine to establish his private practice, so he's a medical doctor, in the early 1920s, he faced entirely new formulas. In Palestine, Naim found that the British officials he had formerly emulated, that he had looked up to, were ruling but not governing. And here, I think it's really important to understand that in this period of British rule between World War I and 1948, British colonial rule in Palestine differs from British and French rule in Lebanon, in Syria, in Transjordan, and Iraq, because Palestinians under the British mandate were denied access to representative institutions and developmental infrastructures, right? And so think about Naim in Sudan, right? He's here, he's confident, he's wearing a pith helmet, he's on the front lines of Western progress, going to Palestine and realizing that he, as a Palestinian native, is now present on the land, but absent in the law. How? What do I mean by that absence? So we all know about the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and we all know that it became a juridical pillar, a foundation for British colonial rule. And that declaration afforded Palestinian Muslims and Christians civil and religious, but not political rights. The declaration and the mandate that would come out of it defined Muslims and Christians by what they were not, right? They became non-Jews. This definition then necessitated the kind of partitioning in territory, in national thinking and ethnicity between Palestine's, at that time, very small Jewish communities, about 5%, and the rest of the inhabitants in Palestine who were Christian and Muslim. So in this formula, Palestinian Muslims and Christians become rootless natives, unworthy of self-determination. So the British mandate depended on using the language of the native while denying that native a political name and a political territory. So this is when we're talking about land back. These are the kinds of dynamics that are common to multiple settler colonial regimes. And so in a way, Naim kind of stood as a sort of specter, a kind of ghost, a present absentee. When the war began in 1948 between Arabs and Jews, although those categories are themselves problematic, right? But we can talk more about that in the discussion. Naim's children and grandchildren fled to Egypt and Lebanon, and Naim and his wife Anise, my great-grandmother, struggled to remain in the midst of the Nakba. And here Naim was maintained his faith in bureaucracy. He was really a partisan of bureaucracy. He was confident, he knew the rules, he understood the importance of evidence, and for 4 years, he gathered certificates and deeds and maps for the lands he owned in the village of Nahr-e-Naba, about 8 miles from Acre. In these petitions, he says, and he insists time and time again, that these lands are, quote, my private property. And he petitions, he appeals, and at every turn, a formidable wall of bureaucracy excludes him. Between June and November of 1949, Naim and Anise found their orchards burnt. 2 years later, impoverished and defeated, they joined their family in exile. Here you see Naim and Anise on the grounds of their burnt orchards in 1949. And here you see, if you just think about that first image and the kind of faith in like the pith helmet and the progress and the, you know, on the cusp of a civilizational conquest, here time has shifted for Naim and Anise. It is no longer a straight line. It isn't confidently marching forward. It's now suspended between crisis and stasis, but they're sort of like in mud, right? Suspended in mud, in waiting. I can say more about my great-grandparents in our discussion. I'm so like honored to be with them in this journey, and the ways that they've appeared to me has made me question so much about myself in all the best ways. But I want to now just return a little bit to the process of how family papers change hands and what that might mean for us as the lessons of history. And I want to get back for a second to my grandmother's love letter. My grandmother May would occasionally ask me, "Do you think we will get any restitution? There is word that we might." Lemia, my aunt, her daughter, loyally guarded this elusive promise of restitution, of recovering former riches, former ways of being before 1948. So Lemia is sort of this archivist, right? She holds tightly to land deeds and shares. And even in this last period when she was moving out of her house and moving in with her brother, she hands these papers to me with so much hesitation. Oh, is everything okay? Yeah. She hands these papers to me with so much hesitation. And she always says to me, "Do you think we're going to get any of this land back? These company shares, do you think that they're worth anything? Are they any good?" And every time she asks me this, I don't know what to say, right? Because I'm stuck in this gap between what the papers mean to her and what they mean to me. So in this last time, I kind of lock eyes with her, and I wanted to say, I will guard them. But at the same time, I'm afraid that my guarding isn't enough or isn't even legible for her, that it might not mean anything to her, my guarding of it, the way I'm sharing it with you and the way I hope to write the history. So most of the time, I just remain silent. Lemia has guarded more than just the hope of restitution. She has, ever since I can remember, embodied this elusive and fragmented dream of familial collectivity. She collected and protected photographs, birth and death certificates, and letters, and she maintained this archive since she was in her 20s, perhaps around the same age that May was when she wrote the love letter to Brahim. That house in the Marias neighborhood in Beirut had witnessed the forging of family intimacy even in exile. It was a place of ingathering, of refugees and elders, of children and adolescents. It was the house where May wept over Ibrahim's body. In my 20s, I made my own long and elusive quest for return. and I was very happy to hear Abir's kind of thinking through return in her opening comments. And so in my 20s, I make a quest for return that I'm still on. And I returned to this house in Montedias, where I was the first and much celebrated grandchild. And it was a house where I played with a blue electric car on these white tiles along the long corridor. It was a house where I experienced being shelled in an escalating civil war. It was the house where my mother carried me over her shoulder, covered my face, and ran for our lives to escape smoke. And when Lemia left that exilic site of ingathering to join the rest of the family in California in the 1990s, she kind of meticulously transported that space of familial togetherness with all of its hopes and broken promises. And when she saved enough, she replaced the flooring in her California home with white tile. Stepping into her Covina home was its own return. So Covina is a place in California, just outside of Los Angeles, where Lemia had her home. And whenever I walked into her house, it was kind of like going back to multiple layers of my own memory, my own grief and commemoration of the first site of diaspora, Lebanon, and of the original site of loss, Palestine. So a few months ago, when I took part in dismembering this house, I inherited these papers that I'm sharing with you, and I'm slowly working through them. And as I do, I'm kind of untying knots of pain to see what I might find. And as I make my way, the practice and the responsibility of our history takes on new levels of urgency, intimacy, and discomfort. It's a rich inheritance. It's full of gifts and struggles and silences. For now, I just wanted to trust you with this tattered paper that made its way from Jerusalem to Acre in the 40s, that crossed militarized borders to Lebanon after the Nakba, that traversed the Atlantic in the 1990s, and now is here with you on this screen. Was this letter preserved and cherished, or was it just by chance that it survived? Do I betray May by reading it to myself or by reading it to you? For now, I trust you with these questions and with what feels to me today a magical occurrence of learning about my grandmother, a woman whose generosity and love was a pillar for me, and a woman who still has so much to teach me. I'm going to turn to now. Is the image okay? Yeah. I'm going to turn now to a second document, which is a passport. And I'm just going to go through the pages with you and then offer some thoughts on it. Is everybody okay? Are people bored? Not bored. Okay, good. I see a baby. Okay, so when Lemia was dismantling her house, she gathered all the papers into piles, some for me, some to take with her to my uncle's house. And at some point, my uncle said, "Oh, here's a pile of passports. Those are for us. We're going to keep these," he said. I paused, trying to contain the waves of emotion washing over me. So I said, "Well, okay, how about I scan them and I can return the originals to you?" And he says, "Oh, yeah, of course." Then Lemia caught my eye and she said, "Just keep them. We have no use for them." So I'm telling you this story because I'm sure in all of our families, we've had interactions like this, right? Where people are like, "No, these are our passports. Like, you can't have those because they're passports, you know?" And it's such a difficult position to be in as a historian, but also as a family member, right? So after a long day of tears and farewells to this last space of the memory of ingathering, I mobilized my grief to travel through my inheritance. I never met my grandfather, Ibrahim. He died before I was born, and his image loomed over my childhood in Beirut. a patriarch whose charisma and humor were a formidable and remembered presence. I never had too many feelings about him, except for perhaps a tinge of sorrow that he abandoned the family so early at about the age I am now. With this passport, I kind of plunged into Ibrahim's movements across borders, and he started taking on all sorts of different dimensions in my life. So I'm going to just show you the passport page by page. So here is the cover. Here is the first insert, and here you can see it says British Passport Palestine, Ibrahim Effendi Naim Otran. The fee he paid, 750 milli. The nationality, Palestinian under Article 1 of the Palestinian Citizenship Order, 1925. His profession, a government office. Here in this page, you see his place of birth, acre, his date of birth. Am I on the wrong one? Yeah. Sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah, there we go. His place of birth, acre, his place of residence, Haifa, his height, the color of his eyes, the color of his hair, the countries of validity. So here we can all imagine a time when a Palestinian passport could be used as valid in every country. Here on this page, you see his photograph. So of course, there's an image for his wife. And here I'm looking at this and thinking, where's May's passport? It's not among these papers. And that's another thing that happens with family papers and just archives generally, in which the stories that are there are as many as the stories that aren't there. And that's something that we have to wrestle with. So here is, here on this page, you see that the passport was issued on 23 August 1939 and expired on 23 August 1944, that it was issued in Jerusalem. And then here you see its renewal, right, until 23 August 1949. So I'm reading this passport, right? I never met this man, my grandfather, and all these momentous dates are kind of swirling in my mind. 1939, the end of the Arab revolt in Palestine. Of course, 1948, and then again 1949. So I'm moving through these pages embellished with the words British passport, and all of a sudden, my grandfather's flurried and rushed itinerary is kind of unfolding in front of me. So I'm going to share with you that itinerary, just to think about what, you know, this everyday person and his life just before the Nakba. What was he doing? How was he trying to manage it? So the first travel we see is on December 30, 1942, and he's going to like a single journey to Egypt. He returns about a little less than a month later. And it appears that he stays in Acre until I'm gonna not look at the chat. If you have something to tell me, just like I'll rely on you taking your mic off, because it's too much to read and present at the same time. Okay, he goes to Egypt December 30, hangs out there till 11 January, and then from about that January until September 1947, he's staying put. Okay. But beginning in the fall of 1947, we start seeing his movements become very frantic, and he's going to Haifa, to the various consulates in Haifa multiple times. He first starts to kind of find an exit on September 18, 1947, when he gets a visa to Lebanon for a little over a month. The visa is adorned with the word istiyaf, or summer vacation. I saw this and I laughed to myself at the dissonance. A month later, he returns to Palestine through the northern border of Ras and Naura. That December of 1947 marked the first phase of the Nakba as attack and counterattack escalated between Zionist settlers and Palestinian forces. Seeing the writing on the wall, Ibrahim made another brief trip to Lebanon in January of that year. He returned a month later in February when the Haganah had escalated its shelling of Arab neighborhoods and villages and authorized the expulsion of the villagers of Arab Suqair and Qisaria, just south of Haifa. Ibrahim tried his luck again, crossing the border to Lebanon in February and again in March. By that time, the Haganah's military advances and the increasing power of the Irgun and the Lehi militias had instilled panic and fear. Palestinians with means fled in the hopes of return. Ibrahim did his utmost to join them, but perhaps he couldn't secure a home for his family or the needed paperwork to get himself, his wife, May, and his two eldest daughters settled, even if temporarily. Ibrahim shifted tactics and tried his luck again in Jordan in March of 1948. Again, he fails and he returns later that month. And it's that month that the Haganah launches Plan Dalit, which was a shift to large-scale, highly organized and sustained operations. This is the time when the war of conquest is in full gear. And as everyone on this call knows, on April 9, 1948, the Irgun and the Lehi forces pillaged the village of Deir Yassin, shooting the fleeing civilians. Deir Yassin intensified the fear throughout Palestine, and by the last weeks of April, the Haganah had overpowered Arab forces in Haifa. The city fell in 2 days. And after the invasion of Arab armies in May 1948, the expulsion of Palestinian villages at the hands of Zionist forces had become regular practice. It must have been a long summer for Ibrahim, May, and their daughters, Lamia and Samia, my mother. By the end of June, 250,000 Palestinians had fled or been expelled under the force of fire. In July, the expulsion of Liddens and Ramlins initiated another escalation. As summer gave way to autumn, the Haganah had conquered the Naqab, the Jerusalem corridor, and the Upper Galilee. Ibrahim crossed again to Jordan in September 1948, only to return empty-handed to his family. His movements became increasingly desperate. He tried Lebanon, Jordan, and finally Syria, entering at Daraa, today its own site of massive dispossession, in October 1948. And it is here that the record of his movements, along with the passport's validity, end. The last visa, the last stamp, is from the Republic of Syria on 4 December 1948. I breathed in that beautiful smell of old paper, studiously noted his comings and goings, brought out the magnifying glass, asked my spouse if he could make out an intelligible stamp. I tried not to be sentimental. I tried not to stop too long at that date, 31 December 1948, when the visa to Syria expired. I imagined his rushing across borders, his repeated visits to the passport office in Jerusalem, to the consular offices in Haifa. I noted the growing urgency his movements between the months of February and May 1948 took. Then it dawned on me that this passport, long expired, long tucked away, of no use, quote unquote, as my aunt put it, was a fragile bridge. Ibrahim touched this document, and now here I was touching it. The last document I'm going to share with you today is a death certificate. My great-grandmother, Anise Qutran, Ibrahim's mother, the wife of Naim, outlived her son. I was there when she died, in that house in Maridiyas, with the entire extended family, the siblings, their spouses, their children, gathered around her as she passed. I was only 7 years old, but I remember Anise as herself formidable, someone to be scared of, to behave around. I'm searching now for her since her husband Naim has taken so much of my attention. Her beauty was legendary, her attention to proper comportment and hygiene stringent. She was only 14 when her family married her to a man much older than her. It is not a painful memory, this last ingathering. It has become so faded for me now that I've wondered if it actually happened. And I always forget to ask my aunts and my parents in between the details and emergencies of the everyday. So the last document I read with you today is her death certificate. It captures this moment of ingathering that has faded from memory and memorializes it. 16 August 1978 at 7 p.m. Anise departed. Born in 1896 in Haifa, she died in exile in Beirut. But there's something new to learn, always. In that space marked for village or space of origin, the death certificate specifies Palestinian identity card. It was from this one rectangle that I learned something new about Anise. Unlike her sister, who acquired the Jordanian citizenship, and her son, Ibrahim, and his children, who mobilized sectarian imperatives to get Lebanese citizenship, Anise spent her last 16 years of exile on the Palestinian identity card, or laissez-passer, that continues to confine Palestinian refugee life and mobility in Lebanon. Now facing the responsibility, the gift of guarding these papers, of reading them, I wrestle with the pillars of my family story, the heroes and the anti-heroes. What can this story and the ongoing struggle in Palestine teach us? So I'm just going to make 3 points here and I'll stop sharing. And then I'll make the 3 points really quickly. I think the first sort of lesson that I want to sit with that I think is important for all of us is inspired by the work of many feminists that I've been honored to learn from, that teach us that grammar matters. Since the Balfour Declaration of 1917, British colonial rule and the Zionist enterprise have defined Palestinians by what we are not, non-Jewish. They've erased both our name and our access to political rights. Claiming our names and toppling the violent grammars of erasure is crucial to exercising politics. Second, our history can really be told through the inclusion and exclusion in the category of the human. This past January, Israeli state officials criminalized 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, including PACC, the Damir, Defense for Children International, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, Bisan Center for Research and Development, and the Union of Palestinian Women Committees. These organizations, as everyone here knows, have sort of anchored the struggle to protect, defend, sustain, and nourish Palestinian life for decades. And today, the Israeli state is attempting to liquidate them as quote-unquote terrorist organizations. We must reject this exclusion from the category of the human, just as we reject our own impulses to evidence that we are good enough, human enough to access basic rights. The key here, I think, is to insist on rather than to evidence our humanity, our humanness. Third and finally, the Palestinians struggling to remain on the land today. The story of my great-grandparents who remained on their land after the Nakba until they were forced out teach us about holding ground. These lessons are more urgent than ever as we struggle to remain rooted in an earth rapidly giving way to mudslides, fire, floods, and drought, and also eroding under the force of unbridled greed. How do we hold this ground? In 1971, the Palestinian novelist Emil Habibi crafted a character that he called the PACC optimist, someone who saw the cup half empty and half full, someone who held tightly to hope and despair as a spectrum. I think today we hold ground by taking tips from this PACC optimist, by listening to our ancestors, not as heroes and not as ghosts, but as guides, guides who teach us that time itself is a terrain of struggle, that we must plan not for, but despite the future, and that love is both the means and the ends of liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sekeli. That was so interesting. I have some questions of my own before we get into everyone else's questions. I first want to say, like, the way that you are able to pursue and fuse your academic research with primary source records that you have unique access to, right, is remarkable. And I'm very grateful that you've chosen us and this group as part of your guarding of your family's history in sharing these extraordinary documents. Not all of us, including some of us attempted family historians, have the same access to these sorts of primary sources within our own families because they've been lost to time. And, you know, we have anecdotal things sometimes, but do you have any suggestions or recommendations you could make for those of us who, you know, are really interested in sort of trying to glean what lessons we can from our own family history, much the way that you have taken these lessons and distilled them into these 3 points for us?
Sure, thank you, Nadia. That's so generous. There's a couple of things I want to say. First, I want to really be very upfront and about like my particular class background, right? So my people are kind of upper middle class. They're not like, I don't come from like the big families, like the Nishashibis and the Husseinis and the Khalidis who like my family were better off in the 19th century. And by the 20th century, they're the kind of family that can have either a fridge or a card, but couldn't have both, you know? And I think it's important for us to really talk about the class differences that have shaped our history and to face them head on. And part of my, yes, actually, all that remains is Walid Khalidi, not Rashid Wali. And it's a wonderful book that we should all read. So I just wanted to kind of really gesture to that because I don't want to, because I think part of the question is about class, right? That part of the question of like this kind of bureaucratic writing practice, the petitions that my great-grandfather did was also about the way that he understood himself as, you know, in my book, I call these people men of capital. They're sort of middle-class actors who understand themselves as taking part in a kind of broader Arab civilizational project and so on. Having said that, I think that every one of us have family papers in an attic somewhere, and they're family papers that our families hold on to for different reasons, and it's a really difficult sometimes even to get a look at them, right? Because people are, and I did this work in Palestine as well, where, you know, people really guard their papers because our papers and our archives are themselves sites of dispossession. Every single Israeli assault on Palestine and the Palestinians has included an assault on our documents, on our archives, which are now housed in Israeli institutions. So I think that it's important that we see our history and our archives as also sites of the dispossession that we're fighting against. The most advice I have is to talk to your elders and to hear their stories and to record their stories. And when you do that, to the thing that I learned, so, you know, oral history is such an important component of our ways of being in Palestine, and the oral historians, like people like Rosemary Sayegh and newer generations like Hannah Sleiman have really talked about how is it that refugee women in particular use kind of storytelling as a historical form, as a sort of cautionary tale. And so I would say this is really an invitation to talk to your elders and ask them questions, and not just questions about the major events of history, right? Because I used to do that when I was doing oral history. I would ask people like, okay, May 1948, tell me where you were. And people don't remember life in that way, right? It's better to ask people about where they went to market. Did they have a favorite store? What was, did they have, what was their wedding like? What was their favorite dish? What was their favorite time of the day? And as people speak and share, they also remember new things in that way. I'll say too, that most of the documents that I have about my great grandfather are really, I have like bits and pieces. And so in a way, as I said, in all of our stories, what remains is as full of silences as it is of information. And so here the creative work is to try and learn about the moments that these people lived. And so in my case, I'm learning all sorts of new things about this time in Sudan that Naima and Anisi were there. That is just teaching me all sorts of new things, and I have to go to other archives to do that, right? So yeah, I would say keep the hope and talk to your elders and try to learn about their lives and record it.
That's actually really great advice. And I appreciate the interviewing tips, especially. I think a lot of us do get hung up on like, what happened the night they arrived? And
right.
It's a really rough place to even ask someone to start to begin on an emotional level. And it may not yield kind of the results that your suggested questions would. I have another question about your trajectory. How did you get started on this? How did this become an interest of yours? And how did you come up with this idea of fusing your family's archives with the sort of more academic and more widely known historical sources? And I guess my like footnote follow-up to that is, how big of an influence is Rashid al-Khaldi? Because I don't know if anyone here has read The 100 Years' War on Palestine, but he also has these incredible, family documents that he's able to interweave with a different narrative that comes from, other sources, external sources.
Okay, great question. So I'll start with the last sort of, because also Walid Khalidi has come up in our chat, and Rashid. I'm really fortunate because I co-edit with Rashid Khalidi, the Journal of Palestine Studies. So he's been a mentor and a model to me. And he is also now a peer, which is a very, amazing gift that I have. And he's Anjad, I cannot say enough what a wonderful person he is to work with, what a feminist he is, and how incredibly open he is to the things that the new generations are bringing. I will say that part of the struggle for people of my generation with thinking, and for people of your generation, Nadia and Abir, is how do we both honor the patriarchal structures that have shaped our history and our intellectual production at the same time that we attempt to forge spaces that are more feminist, more open, more innovative. So one of the things that I feel have contributed to at the Journal of Palestine Studies, and that Rashid has really embraced, is really to highlight the voices and critical work of Palestinians on the ground and Palestinians of new generations, to really think about the political practice and to really embrace new formations. So I think we have to hold on to multiple generational contributions. And we also have to think about, how do we create the ways, how do we do the critical internal work to make freedom possible, right? Because even had we not ever had British colonialism or Zionist settlement, it's not like we'd be in paradise right now. So that's the work that we can do internally, right? And I think this is one of the things that often, for people who are colonized, I think one of the things that often happens is that we tend to center the colonial figure or the settler in our histories. And what people like Rashid Khalidi and Walid Khalidi, Rosemary Sayegh, so many people enabled my generation to do was to say, okay, I don't want to tell the story of the Zionists. I want to tell my story. And, you know, my own trajectory is a long one, and I won't bore you with it. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you, Nadia, and tell you all my stories. But basically, I'll say that it felt like, if I want to narrate it now, I would say I've always wanted to be in a revolution, and that all I ever wanted was to be a revolutionary. And I tried multiple different ways to do that. And I got the chance to live revolution in Cairo because it was my first job. I lived there for 5 years, and then I actually experienced a revolution and realized that, ooh, it's hard and painful. I'm still committed to revolution, and that might feel really crazy that I'm an academic. I know people think academics have a lot of feelings about academics. I do feel very much that the knowledge that we produce is an important terrain for imagining our freedom. And I think that's what keeps me going. And just yesterday, the Middle East Studies Association passed a boycott, divestment, sanctions resolution by 80% of the vote. And I can tell you, I know this is recorded, but I hope that this part will be edited out. I have been part of the organizing core for about 8 years. And this shift is a really important turning point in what is utterable, what is acceptable, and a kind of collective voice that's saying we are no longer going to sit aside in fear as Palestinian life becomes increasingly impossible and constrained in these conditions of unfreedom. How did I get here? Like, kind of accidentally. And I wrote a book called, like I said, I wrote a book called Men of Capital. And that book is basically me proving that I can do history. And, you know, like, it's really weird because I am a revolutionary, but then wrote this book about like capitalists. And my spouse was like, I don't understand why you're writing about these people. Like, you would hate them. You would never vote for them. And I said, well, because they're me. And then after the book came out, I realized I had written about my family without knowing it, because then I found this, that Lemia handed me this file, and I found all of this stuff, like the banks that I'd written about, the phenomenon I had written about, the people I had written about, the accountant that I start my book with, that my great-grandfather went to. So I realized, oh my God, I've been writing about my family for this whole time and I haven't even known it. And so I feel that's why I was saying, like, Naeem has challenged me, because I'm not a religious person, but somehow I feel like there's a kind of cosmic way that he's with me and they're with me, and that our ancestors are with us. And I feel like the last thing I'll say is that I can now do this much more experimental family work, family archive storytelling work, because I have tenure. You see what I mean? Because I wrote this first book and I did it the way that I'm supposed to do it. Now I'm going to do whatever I want. But I'm hopeful that if I do that, then the next generation could write their first book in that way.
That is really, really helpful. I also appreciate the sort of acknowledgement to anti-Palestinian bias in academia. It is something I think a lot of us have personal experience with. There's one specific thing that you just spoke of that I wanted to ask you to comment on a little further. When you talk about the difference in generations, right? And the way that newer generations of storytellers and activists are operating. Can you just tell us a little bit of sort of your impression of the contemporary millennial activists who are typified and led by the El-Kurd siblings?
I don't know that I'm the right person to do that. I can tell you that, I mean, the first thing I would say, and this does come very much from the experience of revolution in Egypt, is that I would just say that we have a tendency sometimes to really emphasize the new generation, which is really wonderful. And those are the people we need to uplift and think of and make space for. I think it's also really important to recognize the work of multi-generations. You see what I mean? And because I think one of the things that this generation of young folks and the Kurd family and so on, I think one thing they do differently is that they're always centering the lessons of the ancestors and the elders, and they're always keeping those lessons in mind. The second thing I would say is, I think sometimes in movement work or in struggles like our struggle, sometimes we want to kind of emphasize how similar we are, but I think it's really important to think about all the differences that we have so that we actually are stronger in our differences, not just in what keeps us together. So I think that there are multiple different kinds of organizing taking place. And it's not as maybe bound to the kinds of ideological blacks and whites that we had historically. Does that make sense? So that I feel like the new generation is like, okay, no, I don't want to choose from the categories that my generation had to choose from. Are you PFLP? Are you DFLP? Are you Hamas? Are you this? Are you that? I feel like people at this stage are like, none of these are working for me, and I want to try to find different ways. And sometimes it is working for them. Well, there is a lot, and that's one of the things I think we have to wrestle with.
Can I ask just a clarifying question about that? In terms of lessons from the previous generations and lessons from the ancestors, and not having to put themselves in these individual labels of strategy and ideology, are you getting at the sort of rejection of respectability politics in organizing?
I would love it if we got to that point. I think that's a really uphill battle. I mean, I was about to say that the work that I and I know Sada Ahmoud is here, and Iman is here, Iman Ghanem. I know, I feel weird talking on behalf of people much younger than me, but I have been really privileged to be part of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. And there I've been really, really moved by an insistence on mutual aid, mutual uplift, and love. And I think things are so dire, not just for Palestinians, but the world over, that we have to kind of follow that lead of mutual aid and uplift to find new ways forward.
All right, I think that is a great place to leave my own personal list of questions. Thank you, Dr. Sekeli. It looks like we do have one question from the audience. That is from Rima Qasim. Proud to say that is my mother. Mom, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead? Mom, you're on mute.
Oh.
Did we lose her altogether?
I think she may have left, but she'll be back.
I hope so.
That totally happens to me. I
Um,
unmute and then I leave the call. Yeah.
Well, since, oh,
wait, I
okay,
think-
she texted her question. She wants to know if you can shed some light on how studying the history can help the political cause.
Yes, I think that our people have been organizing and fighting since the late 19th century. And some of those fights and battles we know about, and some of them we don't know about them. So people think of historical work as like, oh, you go back and then you just tell the stories that everybody knows. But the thing is, doing historical work means telling stories we don't know, finding the stories that we haven't written about. And so I think doing that allows us to understand what lessons people in past struggles have to teach us, and also inspires us to continue in our struggles, despite how sometimes, despairing we might feel, because and I would say this for Middle East history more broadly, for Arab history more broadly. Whenever I teach a survey class, like the big introductory survey class that I teach, which is like 350 people, and my takeaway always to these students is to say, look at how committed people are to dignity and joy and loving life, that really you could tell the entire history of our struggle through the attempts at popular sovereignty in so many different creative ways. And those different creative ways are guides, not just to our past, but to our future.
It's really beautifully said.
She's back. Hi.
Oh, hi, Mom. We asked your question and Dr. Sekeli just answered it. So hopefully we'll be able to share the video.
I heard it. Can I ask one more question quickly?
Come on.
Please.
Shukran. I think you answered it, but I want to hear it again from you. Should we all, and the young generation, Nadia's age and her group, should we feel optimistic? Are we going to see freedom for Palestinians?
I think we have to have some optimism for us to fight the long battle. And I think the freedom that we will see will be as a result of those small battles that might make the broader war possible. And I think it's so painful for me I feel so much responsibility to say we should be hopeful or not, because I'm so conscious of how worse things are on the ground than they've ever been in our history.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel like we are, and I think Abby had really gestured to this powerfully in her opening comments, we are at a real turning point and I'll tell you, for example, in this BDS vote, like in this Middle East Studies Association, believe me, when I joined academia and this field back in 1998 as a graduate student, we could never have passed a resolution like this. Even 15 years ago, we could never have passed a resolution like this. Never could we even have dreamed of it, even 10 years ago. And we did it. And we did it because we were patient and we rejected the politics of celebrity, which is, I think, very destructive for us. I mean, this is just me, like, probably being whatever, annoying, but sometimes I feel like this happens in organizing circles and it happens in academia. People get a little too much into their eye, you know, and their egos and their presence. And I think for us at Mesa, doing this under the radar, the Middle East Studies Association, staying under the radar, doing, you know, what the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci called the war of maneuver, just like really maneuvering and moving slowly and with consensus. And we saw real change. Also, I mean, even though there have been really powerful critiques of the Human Rights Watch report and the Human Rights Watch report, the Amnesty International calling it apartheid in our situation in Palestine. People have been critical of it. But here's where I would say optimism is needed, because those organizations are calling it apartheid because Palestinians have been calling it apartheid since 2004, because Palestinians made a call for boycott, divestment, sanctions, because Palestinians said this is apartheid. And that's even that, Rima, if I might call you Rima, is the part of the story, right? That is too now a history, that in 2004, this call came out from civil society organizations and they said, this is apartheid, and the way to get it, the way to challenge it is through the same methods that people used in South Africa: boycott, divest, sanctions. And, you know, the last thing I'll say about this, and you know, I know I've taken up a lot of time and it's about time to go to the next session, which looks amazing, is that, you know what we learned in this last round of the BDS organizing? That people were really, some of the fence sitters were like shocked by how quickly the boycotts against Russia took place. Right? And I thought, oh, that's so interesting, right? Because it's like, you know, for so long, people have been racializing our call for a boycott and saying that it's somehow like racist or anti-Semitic or whatever, and that it's destructive, and no, you can't do this, no, you can't. Russia is devastating Ukraine. It's so painful to watch the massive dispossession. And within days, Apple, Coke, McDonald's, MasterCard, Visa, Swift, like it's been so you know, quick and powerful. And so yeah, I think that we will see more freedom. I think that we have to do it in alliance and mutual uplift with multiple other peoples in crisis, and I hope that our generation will see more freedom.
Inshallah. I guess we should leave things there because we are out of time, unfortunately, but to my mind, that's just a sign that this conversation was greatly overdue. I do want to say thank you, Dr. Saikadi, for offering this thought-provoking insight and giving us some hope. Sallim Ideki, Sallim Ra'lik for all of this incredible work. I also have to thank Mona and Bassem Hishma's Foundation for continuously supporting PACC. As a fan of PACC, I am very, very grateful, as well as the ET Staffing and Consulting LLC, who has sponsored our conference. ET Consulting and Staffing specializes in engineering recruitment and staffing in medical device and pharma industries. They place engineers at contract and full-time based positions based on their clients' requirements. So check them out if that is something that you are interested in. And do we have a trivia question queued up? Okay. So here is a trivia question. Liali just put it in the chat. Before we transition to the next session, just go ahead and click on the link to the Google Doc in there. And if you answer the trivia question, you will have a chance to win a PACC conference shirt. So I hope you were paying attention. And with that, thank you everyone for your attention. I hope you learned as much as I did, and we'll see you in the next segment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for moderating that. Thank you so much, Secretary Sekli, for all, this just took me back to our conversations in Santa Barbara. And so it's just so great to, even though it's virtually, to see you again and hear, you share all your wisdom. So thank you so much for all of that. Also in just such like a powerful storytelling way. I loved all of it. So thank you again on behalf of everyone at PACC. We are going to just transition into our next session. I want to be mindful of everyone's time so that we can end at a timely manner, especially for those of us in the East Coast. I'm very honored and excited to be introducing this panel that we have. I'm going to start by introducing the moderator and our two speakers of the panel, and then I'm going to let them kind of, and our moderator kind of, talk a little bit about what the focus is and we're talking about. But if you saw the program booklet, then you know that we are, starting off this, we're going to be talking about Palestinian Indigenous solidarity and specifically in the fights against cultural appropriation and exclusion and, the fight for our existence, right? And this is a very important conversation that we always have at the beginning of our conference because it helps ground us and remind us of the coalition work that's also really necessary and important to have. I saw a question in the chat, I'm sorry we couldn't get to it, about how to make sure, fighting claims of anti-Semitism. I do just want to flag that that question will also be answered tomorrow in day 2. We're going to be hearing from Mariam Barghouti, and we have a solidarity panel, and I think that perfectly ties in. So please tune in tomorrow to get that answer questioned. But without any further ado, so again, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our moderator and the panelists, and then hand it off. It's so great to be introducing Dr. Iman Ghanayem, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University. She earned her PhD in English with minor degrees in American Indian Studies and Gender and Women's Studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research examines Palestinian and American Indian literatures and the larger context of global Indigenous and refugee narratives through a framework of interconnected settler colonialisms and comparative indigeneities. Dr. Ghanayem is going to be moderating this panel. Our first panelist, who I'm very excited to be connecting with and just to be learning from, is Dr. Robert Warrior, who is the Hall Distinguished Professor of American Literature and Culture at the University of Kansas and a citizen of the Osage Nation. He is the co-author of Like a Hurricane, the Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee, and the author of Tribal Secrets, Recovering American Indian Intellectual Traditions, and also of The People and the Word, Reading Native Nonfiction. He was one of the 3 authors of American Indian Literary Nationalism and a member of the Native Critics Collective that produced Reasoning Together. Unfortunately, that was just a shortened version of your bio. There's so much that Dr. Robert Warrior has done, but just for the sake of time, but I highly recommend you check out all the books and all the stuff that Dr. Warrior has put out. It's our next panelist, who I'm also very excited to be introducing, is Dr. Sara Ahmed, who is a Chicano-Palestinian anthropologist whose work takes Palestine and the Palestinian diaspora as sites for which to explore questions of race and ethnicity, gender violence, settler colonialism, indigenous politics, and feminism in comparative and transnational perspectives. Her research has been published in Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Studies, Biography, State Crime Journal, and Jerusalem Quarterly, and has been supported by fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the Wenner Gren Foundation, and the Palestinian American Research Center. Dr. Ahmed is a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and is an assistant professor of anthropology at the College of Holy Cross. I'm just so grateful and honored to be introducing all 3 of you. Dr. Iman, the floor is all yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Awesome. Masal khair. I am so excited to be moderating this panel today. And following this amazing talk by Dr. Shireen Sekali, who's always going far and beyond in what she generously offers and gives Palestine, Palestinians, and our cause. It's an amazing first day already. I was part of last year's conference within a similar theme to what we have today. So I'm beyond honored to be part of this conference as well. This panel is very close to heart, and I promise to moderate it to the best of my abilities. I will say, however, that I've been sick all week and had to cancel everything except this. I had to get out of bed to dress and sit for the panel. And so if I mute or step for like a minute to cough while in my family, we have to cough while standing if we're sitting. I don't know, there's a logic to it, but please, I apologize in advance. The theme is solidarity between Palestinians and indigenous peoples on these occupied lands that we inhabit, and for that also have a responsibility to liberate. Solidarity is a cluster of words and feelings. Solidarity starts with learning about each other, educating ourselves, reading, and asking the right questions. Solidarity is about building a relationship where the basis for that relationship is not pity, exploitation, tokenization, or condescension, but love, genuine affection, seeing the other as the same, and loving them and loving their fight the way we want to be loved. This is where it begins, and it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm always making mistakes, but saying the wrong things, the fallahi comes up, but it's all part of the process. Dr. Warrior, who is a highly prolific Osage scholar, especially in his amazing scholarship on indigenous literature and literary resistance, which is something Palestinians are very familiar with, we always resist through our writings, has been a fierce advocate for the Palestinian cause for decades. I will let him share more of that story, but I will use this space to express my personal gratitude. Dr. Warrior was one of the faculty members in the American Indian Studies program at the University of Illinois, where I went for graduate school. Though I was admitted to the English department, it was AAS that lobbied for me 10 years ago to be admitted. 2 years in a row, I was rejected the first year. This is a good story on trying more than once. They even offered me, AAS even offered me a fellowship for the first 2 years of my education. And if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for him, and if it wasn't for that community, which was my actual home, on that very cold campus that was very, very violent towards Palestinians and natives and a lot of people, I would not be here today. So this is not an exaggeration. This is a true story. I dedicated my life for indigenous studies because of that, just like I dedicated my life for fighting for our cause, but that's a whole different story. The two dedications do not and should not conflict. I met Dr. Hamoud for the first time at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Conference, another destined placement. It was my first PhD year, my first time in Texas. I was not even on the program, but the chair of the panel wanted me to present anyways, and I did. Dr. Hamoud gave at the time what I thought was the best conference presentation I have ever heard. It was a paper on death in East Jerusalem, and it was handled with so much care and grace and deep reverence. It almost felt like listening to a prayer. Her work on Palestinian homes, women, love, and care always feels so profound and like the very meaning of a healing experience. What's even more special about Dr. Hamoud is that in all my time hauling myself through conferences, and there were so many, Dr. Hamoud was the only co-panelist I've ever been on a panel with who emailed me afterwards to offer help if I ever needed it. It may sound like a small gesture, but years later, it would become the basis for us to become friends. So this is the true meaning, non-evacuated gift of support. And this is the raw stuff of solidarity. So now, like mushiness aside, my notes aside, let's get into the questions. I have 4 questions. Please take them however you want. Please alternate however you want. The first question is a personal one, a question that can help the audience know a little bit about your journey into the work of anti-colonialism and decolonization. The Caribbean psychoanalyst and anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon described the experience of finding out a truth related to colonization, whether it's ours or others, as an encounter. like an event. You run into something or someone, you have a conversation that leads to a major shift in how you think and see yourself in the world. Dr. Warrior, how and when did you encounter Palestine and the reality of its colonization? And directing a similar question to you, Dr. Hamoud, how did you encounter the truth about settler colonization and the peril of indigenous peoples in the settler colony called the United States? How did this encounter influence you? Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. So it's a great question, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. I'm really grateful to have been invited to participate, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And it's great to see Dr. Kanayem again, and this I haven't seen her very much since she became a doctor. And you know, this was really a worry when we went through some of the things we went through at Illinois, and our program was nearly destroyed, all but destroyed. And you know, our students were the ones that we worried about, and with good reason, because they were under attack as much as any of us were. And just so great to see your success and your persistence, and that I never doubt it when Palestinian people persist and succeed because of that fighting spirit. But it's hard to watch when other people are under attack. So it's really gratifying now to be here and to be moderated by you know, by you in this. So thanks very much for agreeing to do it. So when I think of the question about how I was introduced to Palestine, I was introduced to Palestine in Palestine. I guess instead of getting to the good solidarity part, I can always start by saying I started as a volunteer worker for the Israeli Department of Antiquities and Museums, and I went to Israel and Palestine lived in Tiberias for 2 summers, doing archaeology at the top of what we call the Sea of Galilee. And it was during that time, I mean, that first summer that I was there, I was surrounded by Palestinians everywhere that I looked, but I didn't see them. I mean, I think that I was really a victim of that erasure of knowing people were there. We were on a site that we were students, or about 40 students who were digging day by day. And on the other side of a stone wall, we were with the Greek Orthodox, had one part of the site. The Franciscans had another part of the site. And on the other side, the Franciscans just employed day laborers, Palestinian day laborers. And I'd always look across that wall and I would see those people who were working much harder than we did, who were just being ordered around by Franciscan priests, you know, wondered how the world could be so different, you know, for them. And we also saw just in Tiberias has a sizable Palestinian population, but it was the next summer that I really got to see a different. I got a different view on both the Palestinian world and even my own indigenous experience as an Osage person. A friend of mine who was going that summer to dig had contact with somebody in the city of Ramla, which is inside of the Green Line, inside of Israel, and on the other side of the Green Line in Israel, and has a significant Palestinian population. And we stayed with this person that he had contact with for a week, and he had a lot of young Palestinian friends, and I got to know them. And I didn't really understand why at that point, but people finding out that there was this young Native American student who was in Ramla was something that kind of got around the neighborhood, as it were. And those young people who I was getting to know were taking me places, and people were just really interested in hearing more about me, more about my experiences as a Native American person. the overwhelming hospitality of Palestinian people that I encountered in going to people's homes and eating much more than I could eat, and just the delicious food and great company and wonderful coffee, and it was really so eye-opening. It was a real eye-opening part, along with these great friendships that I made with people around my age, was that at the end of that week that we spent in Ramla, these young friends of mine were, and they were a little bit older than me, maybe 2 or 3 years older. They had been working for the last 6 months on having a clinic of Palestinian doctors coming into Ramla, and nurses as well, and other workers, and bringing people in so children could get checkups and could get vaccinations. They were working on that all week, and we were kind of working on it with them and trying to help when we could. And the one thing that they didn't have by Friday morning was the final permit they needed from the city. We'd been trying to get it through the week, and people got more and more worried by Thursday night that they wouldn't have it, so that they could have on Saturday, they could have this clinic. The short version of all of that is on Friday afternoon, they went to the little window where they were able to ask for this one more time, and they were refused. And so spent the rest of the day doing this heartbreaking work of contacting every single doctor, every single nurse, every single person, every community organizer, every person who was planning to come to Ramla to have their children vaccinated, to have doctors look at them, nurses to help them out, and to cancel the entire thing. And it was just so devastating to be around that and to see the bureaucratic indifference, the way that bureaucratic indifference is such a weapon that's wielded against people, and that the impact is direct. People say, we don't know if colonialism is actually bad for you or not. It's like, well, I think I saw it right there. It totally impacted the health of these young people, and there's a lot more proof than that as far as I'm concerned, but it is one of those moments where you say, this is the direct moment when you see oppression in action, because it's not only so awful that this thing that was supposed to happen didn't happen, it was also so devastating to the people who'd made it, who worked on it. So disheartening. And of course they have to pick themselves up, and then they have to continue on, which takes even more energy. I think after that, I had a lot of, I felt like I needed to know a lot more about Palestine. I needed to know a lot more about the history of where I was. And I gained that, but that was really the place where I saw just 2 stories from the dig that I was on. And I've written about this in a long essay. It's not published yet, the whole thing. I did publish a part of it last summer. The 2 things happened in our dig. One was that there was a burial found on our dig site, on our archaeological site. And we didn't know what was going on because it was very secretive, because anytime there's a burial, then it becomes very complex for an archaeological dig. And because they didn't know who the burial was, what kind of person it was it an Arab, was it a Jew, was it a Christian, who was buried. Everything was being done very secretively, very carefully, but we did find out what it was, that it was a burial that was going on. Eventually, our dig director figured out that it was an Arab burial, and within 25 minutes, 30 minutes, everything was picked up and gone. The skeletal remains of the person who had been excavated were put into a box, headed off somewhere into the bowels of the department, somewhere into a big warehouse. Whereas if it had been a Jewish burial, it would have been a very big deal, or a Christian burial, it would have been a very, very big deal. It would have taken weeks and months and years to figure out what was happening. And to see that sort of desecration happening right there in front of us was really astounding. Also at the very end of that summer, that second summer, we had a South African film crew come through, and I couldn't really put it together in my mind yet, but the reason the South African film crew was there, they were filming bright, shiny American young people like us a travel, kind of a travel documentary to show people in South Africa, here's someplace you can go as a South African and to see really wonderful things, and you'll be welcomed in this part of the world where you may not feel welcome other places. And there was this you know, this quid pro quo kind of aspect to all of this. And there was somebody else on the dig who was doing anti-apartheid work at the time at Notre Dame, where she was in college. And she just organized what turned out to be a small, but to me very meaningful boycott of the dig. We did a sick out basically, and refused to go out that day that the film crew was there. And I realized years and years later that that was the first time that I boycotted Israel. And I'm really glad that I did, you know, because as I wrote in my little essay about this, not only did I get to be on the right side of the issue, but I also really got to experience one of the realities that's so wonderful of solidarity, which is the camaraderie, which you don't know what that will feel like until you're actually in the middle of it. And you're in the middle of a really tough situation or something, you don't know what will happen. But the one thing you do have is each other. And there's something to be said for that always, you know, that knowing that you have people there who stepped over a line to support each other is, I think, really important. I can say more about that later, but I don't want to talk too long.
Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And thank you again, Iman, Dr. Ghanem, for the generous introduction. It was just so heartwarming to hear these stories and to remember as well. And it's such an honor to be invited to be a part of this conversation with two scholars who I admire so deeply, Dr. Ghanem and Professor Warrior, and deep gratitude to our community leaders who've organized this conference with so much love and care, especially our fellow PFC member, Abir Sabah. So before answering the first question, can I just get a little show of hands from the audience? Do we understand what we mean when we say settler colonialism? I feel like it's a term that we're throwing around a lot, but I'm not sure that we kind of understand what we mean. Can I just get like a little hands up, hands down icon, if you can? All right, I see a few hands up. I see a few. All right, but there are a bunch that aren't responding, so I'm just gonna take a moment to open that up just a bit, just in case there may be any confusion.
It feels weird to respond to like, yes, I know settler colonialism, you know, like
yes. I know, it really does. But right, but I think as a foundation, right, for considering your question, Professor Ghanem, exactly, no. It's important to understand why we uplift the language of colonialism, right? And settler colonialism in particular, and referring to Palestine, right? Our people have been using this language to understand our condition and our struggle against the Zionist project for decades. And recently there's been a recentering of the language of settler colonization to understand the structure of violence and erasure that we're facing as a people, both by our intellectual and political leaders and coming kind of organically from the streets in the homeland, right? So what do we mean by settler colonialism? We mean that Israel is a colonial project that is predicated on a logic of native elimination, a project that destroys in order to replace, right? That aims to destroy native Palestinian life in order to replace it with a new settler entity, and a project that is structural and continuous and not an event. This is why we say that, right, the Nakba happened in 1948, but the Nakba is also a structure that is continuously shaping the conditions for Palestinian life in the homeland, and that structure also reverberates across the Shatats, right, or the still emerging diaspora of Palestinians of which we're a part in the US, right? So most recently with the Unity Intifada this past spring, we saw the reemergence of this framework as a way of enabling us to understand our collective condition as Palestinians, no matter where we're situated, whether in occupied territory, in Jerusalem, in 1948, in Gaza, in the Nakab, in the Shatat, regardless of the borders imposed on us by the Zionist regime, we're one Palestinian people. This is the language that was really uplifted. One indigenous people, right, that is surviving and resisting an ongoing settler colonial project. So I just wanted to kind of outline that for a moment. Now, to get back to your original question, Dr. Hanayem, I think, I encountered the truth, what you call the truth about settler colonization, and what you're calling the peril of Indigenous people before I had that language of settler colonialism, right? Through my maternal grandmother, who was born in Mexico. And I think my mom is in the room. Shout out to my mom for watching my 3 kids so that I could be here right now, and who I was very close to growing up, Guadalupe. So my grandmother used to tell me stories as a child, not only about the indigenous cultures of our people in Mexico and the occupation of Mexico by the US government and all of the violences that were bound up in that project, but also about what she called our relatives here in Native communities. And I don't mean, that she meant that in a literal way, but that she was sensitive to the Native American condition as being interconnected with her own condition as a Mexican woman who lived undocumented for most of her life, right? Who had experienced extreme forms of oppression and violence at the hands of the US government. And I think that sensitivity was passed down to my mother, who was a community activist, who is a Chicana feminist, and who was active in the 70s, not only in our own community, but also with AIM, with the American Indian Movement, and sort of always, maybe not with these high theoretical terms that I use right now as her daughter, but in a more organic way, always framed the oppression of Indigenous people in the United States as being interconnected with that of our own people, right? From Mexico, from other brown, kind of Black, working class, otherized groups who experienced some form of social marginalization where I grew up on the south side of Chicago. So I think more than anything, that sort of attunement to racism, to poverty, to the environmental degradation of our community on the Southeast side, to these different forms of violence and inequality and sort of forced ruination that our communities faced and still face today, right, is something that really shaped me as a child. Now my father is Palestinian. He came here to study when he was a teenager, and then he was barred from returning home. So he became a refugee, right? But it wasn't through my Palestinian identity that I personally came to a political consciousness about Palestine. And I think in part, that's because, like many elders in our community, my father was so traumatized and kind of humiliated by the experience of forced removal from his homeland that he didn't impart a lot of that knowledge and history and wisdom onto me, right? So my Palestinian identity was something that I had to seek out on my own and with my community. And I began, my own journey to becoming a scholar, studying Guatemala and the political subjectivities and struggles of Maya women in the aftermath of the genocide. So I had grown up more situated within the Latinx and Black and working class white communities in Chicago, and had become politicized as a young person traveling to Latin America and living there for a time, learning about these histories of US military intervention in the region from the perspectives of those who were survivors of mass violence and very much inspired by third world liberation movements. So as a young graduate student at the University of Texas, I started my formation studying Central America, indigenous social movements, sovereignty, and my dissertation research was initially about Maya women who were organizing against feminicide or the killing of indigenous women in the aftermath of the Civil War and genocide. So there are actually 2 formative things that happened, 2 moments for me during this time that set me on a path to working as a scholar in Palestine. The first is that while I was conducting summer research for my master's thesis in Guatemala, I was meeting with a group of feminist Maya scholars and activists. And I had a series of conversations about indigeneity in Palestine. And one of the women who was a survivor of the genocide had recently been a part of a delegation of women of color to Palestine. And she said something to me during a meal. She was sitting across the table from me, and I will never forget this moment. But she said, Sara, do you know what is happening to your people in Palestine? Do you consider yourself to be a member of an indigenous diaspora? And I had never up until that point thought about the Palestinian context in those terms, right? I had never considered myself to be a part of an indigenous diaspora. But that was the beginning of a longer conversation. And it was a very humbling moment for me as a young person, as a scholar in a very early stage of formation, to be kind of pushed in this sort of gentle way to really explore some of the issues I was exploring in Guatemala through the lens of indigeneity and colonialism. In Palestine, of course, you know, I would also learn that it was not only a struggle for land and resources that indigenous Guatemalans shared with Palestinians, but that Israel had also played its own hand in the dirty wars of Latin America during the Cold War era. Many of you may be familiar with those histories, right? When human rights abuses forced the Carter administration to halt military aid to Guatemala, Israel became a surrogate for the United States, supplying, you know, weapons and also training to the military regime during the height of the genocide of indigenous peoples. And of course, there was also this long history of anti-colonial solidarity with Palestine in the Latin American region, right? So we see, you know, these kind of decades and decades where Israel is also playing this role in kind of, you know, militarization and violence against indigenous people across the globe, and where there's, you know, a history of kind of transnational solidarity with our people. So the summer after finishing that thesis, I was compelled to finally go to Palestine to see things for myself. And that first trip to Palestine was, you know, a transformative experience, you know, like Professor Warrior was saying, just kind of the routine witnessing, obviously, but in many ways, my experience crossing the border in Tel Aviv at the airport was the first moment where I actually felt viscerally, right, in my body, what it meant to be interpolated as Palestinian by the colonial state. And you mentioned, Dr. Ghanayem, Fanon's experience of kind of finding out a truth about colonization. And that experience was very much that moment for me. It was the first time that I saw myself through the eyes of the colonizer, that I experienced the visceral sense of racism such that I had never felt before in my life. And I came to know that intimately, you know, what it meant to be Palestinian. And then of course, what I saw and experienced during that first trip really opened my eyes. And at the same time, I was welcomed into a community. I was treated as someone who's coming home. And when I returned with a different kind of commitment. And so I came to know Palestine through the lens of anti-colonial struggle from other indigenous peoples globally, who saw their own experience reflected in the Palestinian condition, and who taught me about the kind of foundational interconnectivity of our struggles.
Thank you both so much for sharing all these personal stories with us. I have 3 questions left, so I'm gonna kind of clips them into like 2 questions and give each one 10 minutes, because we have, I think, 20 minutes, 25, 23 minutes left. So the second question has to do with the title, right? And the panel title has in it, you know, the word erasure. So could you please tell us about the erasure inflicted upon Palestinians and American Indians? You can each feel free to talk about specifically, you know, your direct context, or talk about it comparatively, however you want to take the question. What are some forms of that erasure? What are some of its harms? And how do natives and Palestinians push against it? Yes, and feel free to start, Professor Warrior.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So I think that my experience that I talked about already, that was one of the important parts of that experience for me, was seeing the way that I had been someplace before, right? And that I had spent 6 weeks in, and that I thought that I knew. I mean, we stayed on in the east part of Jerusalem, directly east of the old city, because that's where archaeologists stay by the American School of Oriental Research. And so been surrounded by Arab people, Arab culture, had driven by tons of settlements and things. And yet that I was able to interpret all of that through the lens of erasure that I didn't even know was working was even operating, right? That it was very much just already in place. And that really helped me then to understand my own experience as a Native person in the US, that these underlying structures were very much the same. I mean, they're not exactly the same because they're very different places in terms of size, location, history, but that this is the part I think that actually brings people together more than anything, is understanding what it is to be erased. Just because of some things I'm teaching this semester, I was just thinking about something by the late, just recently passed Lee Maracle in her book of essays, I Am Woman, where she says, she uses the phrase, I erased invisibility. And that she then, that there's something about it that actually has to be done very actively to undo that sense of erasure. And part of that process, I think, is going into your own psyche, into your own consciousness, and seeing the ways that it operates for you. What are the assumptions? Not that somebody said, hey, I want you to buy into these 5 assumptions. Would you please sign here? It doesn't work like that. They just kind of build up over time, and you don't really know that they're there until you really actively work through them. I think that scholarship is one way to push against these things and to fight back against them. But I think also that has to be done in a really intentional way. Anytime that as a scholar, you want to lay claim to doing something good for the people you're trying to write about, I think that you have to not just put it out there that you're doing that and that you're keeping your fingers crossed that it will, but you've got to figure out ways to make yourself accountable to that commitment. You have to be able to see if the things that you value actually happen. And then did you squish the 2 questions together yet? Were those 2 together?
We're not squished. It was a question about, so could you maybe tell, because most of the audience members, are Palestinian and Arab. So
right.
Maybe share a little bit about what they don't know about how indigenous peoples in the United States, or like this, this colonized land, are raised, right? In ways maybe they're not aware of, right?
Yeah, sure. And I can talk about my own experience as an Osage person, and that's a very long history, and tons and tons of things can be said about it. And but I always think that that the main thing that happens for Native American people and indigenous people more generally, but for us as Native American people in the U.S., is the way that things are structured. Our erasure is one that keeps us in the past, so that we're stuck in the past. We're not stuck. That's the identity that I think that we're stuck in, so that everybody around the world, you can go to places where very few people know to know anything specific about contemporary Native Americans, but they do know. They can put their fingers behind their head and go woo woo. They can say, hey, this is like an image that I have from Hollywood Westerns, wherever it's from, but that's an image from the past. And that being stuck in the past is part of the challenge. First of all, to figure out a past that isn't that past, right? I think that's a big part of that, but also to struggle to make people understand that there are contemporary people who persist as peoples. I was teaching today about something about law. I was talking about my relative who's the Chief Justice of the Osage Supreme Court. And so even saying that there is such a thing as an Osage Supreme Court and that it has a Chief Justice who's my relative, I think it's an important way of saying it's not a club that you belong to. It's not really an ethnicity, although there's sort of ethnic traits, I think, sometimes to being Osage. But I think that a really important part of all of that is that we're a people in the world, and that what the US by mistake, I think, has had to recognize, or just by circumstance has had to recognize, is that our peoplehood comes out of an inherent sense of who we are. It's not something that we're going begging for from the United States. We're fighting against the US to be able to define that for ourselves. But that's what we're drawing on as a people, is that long sense of who we are, who we've been. So we, like the other 570 or so recognized Native American nations in the US. That doesn't count Canada, that doesn't count all the way through the way that peoplehood is figured in Central America, South America, Mexico, and other places. We are a people in the world. We have our own Congress, but we also have other things about us, our own social world. Of course, we're surrounded by the US, and we're surrounded by the media in the same way everybody is, but that there is this persistent sense of Osages as a people. We may just be 25,000 people, which isn't very many, but that there is that persistent sense of our own sense of who we are together.
Thank you so much. And something that I want to flag to the audience is the word, native kind of functions sometimes, the way the government and the way, settlers use it, the way people use Arab, that they forget the fact that it's so versatile, it's so diverse, it's so different. Even the forms of persistence, even the forms of lives are so, variable. So there's no such thing as just one singular identity that you can blanket over like a huge population like that. Dr. Hamoud, please, maybe you can talk more about how erasure has been inflicted on Palestinians, and you can either talk about Palestinians in Palestine or maybe Palestinian Americans, however you want to take it.
Thank you so much. Yes, so we talked a little bit about settler colonialism as a structural force, right? A bit earlier, structural formation. And I think within settler colonial contexts, indigenous populations are subject to, this logic of elimination through which space, temporality, the life of indigenous peoples are not conceived as possessing the same rights as those of the colonizer, right? But are instead subjected to the sort of exclusionary and lethal practices of the state. So in the Palestinian context, back home, this logic of elimination has operated through a number of mechanisms, including ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, mass incarceration, home demolitions, segregation, the surveillance and policing of our history and our memory as Palestinians, the appropriation of our archives, as Dr. Ali was talking about earlier, the appropriation of our food and our cultural and political practices, We see these things happening all the time in new modes. And this is just to name a few aspects of this machinery of violence. Obviously, a bit earlier, I touched on how these logics also extend into the US settler colony and how there is articulation between the two in some ways, So I think in part, we see this in terms of the criminalization of our speech, the criminalization of our being as Palestinian, our right to speak our identity as a people within various spaces, whether it's the academy or out on the streets organizing, as artists, as kind of community leaders, whatever that may be. This machinery is kind of vast and operates in a number of different ways. I want to, I guess, talk a little bit more about how this erasure works through a feminist and critical race lens, How do we understand that Palestine is both a struggle against racism and a feminist struggle, or Palestinian liberation, that is? So I guess to understand the construction of Palestinianness as a racialized identity subject to eliminatory violence, we need to understand Israel as a racial state and Zionism as a political movement that is derivative of the European Enlightenment. And part of the Zionist project has always been about this idea of kind of rehabilitating Jewish identity and especially Jewish masculinity, So legal scholar Noura Erakat has this article about Jewishness as property, which kind of articulates with Cheryl Harris's idea of whiteness as property in the United States. And she talks about how rather than challenging the Orientalist images that excluded and subjugated Jews in Europe, Zionism internalized and reproduced them, right? So Israel's founders reified European supremacy in giving new value onto a particular kind of Jewish subjectivity and nationality in relation to Palestinians, right? And so there was this initial kind of alliance with global white supremacy in that it absorbed the racial logics that were foundational to Enlightenment Europe, right? That is the kind of basis of a number of settler colonial projects, including the one that we are living through right now. So if we understand Zionism as a racial project, and this is where I'm getting, right, we can also understand that Palestinians are not the only victims of Zionism. On the one hand, right, Zionism was a form of imperialism that, according to Professor Said Ali, quote, sought to civilize those Black, brown, and yellow people as part of white racial and cultural hegemony. And on the other hand, as Mizrahi scholars have talked about, Arab Jews are also victims of Zionism, right? Because Zionism required the European Jew to create a racialized and inferior other. So I think in all of these analytical frameworks, what they allow us to see is that what's happening in Palestine today is actually not at all exceptional, but is a wider reverberation of the failures of European nationalism and is an expression of global white supremacy that harms Palestinians and Jews alike, right? So I think this is sort of, one of the central contradictions of the Zionist project, that, in the case of Zionism, a particular people were promised entry into this category of the human, right, through this kind of performance of European identity, right? And they embraced the very kind of civilizational hierarchies from which they sought to escape, right? So in many ways, this ongoing dispossession that we face as a people is also an outcome of, the inherent violence of nationalism, right? And of those kind of projects. So I think we can talk about the implications of this a bit later. I know you have a question about kind of decolonization and kind of how we then can understand that as a basis for kind of the interconnectedness of struggles in terms of solidarity work. As a Palestinian woman and a feminist, I think it's also important that we understand this project of erasure through a feminist lens, and the particular ways that the Zionist project has targeted Palestinian women's bodies and sexualities, right? And kind of formations of kind of gendered power more generally. And I have learned a great deal here from and continue to think with the insights of Native feminist scholars to understand the violences inflicted on Palestinian women's bodies and sexualities across time and geographic spaces. As Native women, our very bodies are a cultural locus, right? Because in our bodies, we carry the possibility of giving life to the next generation of Palestinians, and along with that, indigenous sovereignty, indigenous futurities that are contestations of the colonial project, right? So there's this surveillance and policing of women's bodies and sexualities that has always kind of been central to the demographic politics of kind of Palestinian erasure in the settler colony. That has also targeted, not only our bodies and sexualities, but our kinship relations, our relationships to each other, our relationship to the land, right, as a central component of this erasure. I could also go off on a tangent about patriarchy. I don't know if we had time for that. That might take a while, but maybe we can come back to that. I know we're running out of time, but I guess I'll stop with some comments on kind of what we've done to resist, right? Which could also take a lot of time, but despite colonial violence, right, we've always been in a constant practice of persisting, of reconstituting and remembering our kind of social body as a people, right, in response to and against the colonial regime. And here I find Kehaulani Kauanui's concept of enduring indigeneity to be important, right, that the operative logic of settler colonialism may be to eliminate the native, but that indigenous peoples are always existing, resisting, and persisting within these various structures, right? We persist in continuing to love each other, in continuing to love Palestine, and that love is inextinguishable. I think we've seen that, right? Just through the course of the beginning of this conference, we continue to build kinship relations, just as our people continue to fight the materialities of colonial violence in the homeland, right? In defending their homes in Sheikh Jarrah from settler incursions, and rebuilding their homes after demolition in Jerusalem and the Nakab, in starving their bodies in the space of the colonizers' prison, right? Tomorrow, there's set to be one of the largest prison strikes, hunger strikes in the prisons that we've seen in years. And so we construct Palestine and assert our identity as Palestinians in a multiplicity of ways, through our language, through performing our culture, through the food that we eat, through our spiritual practices, uplifting the wisdom of our grandmothers and our ancestors, through the stories that we tell our children, through keeping our histories alive, right? We keep Palestine alive, and Palestine lives wherever we live as Palestinians. So I think this is the radical power of decolonial love, rooted in our generative relationships with each other, where we enact love and care. And Professor Warrior has this concept of intellectual sovereignty, and I borrow this from Palestinian historian Rana Barakat, who challenges us as Palestinians to imagine outside of the restrictions of Zionism, right? To cultivate this radical imaginary of our freedom. And Adrienne Marie Brown writes that, quote, "Imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma," end quote. So I think one of the questions for me is also, how do we reclaim that right to dream our Palestinian future? How do we strengthen this muscle to imagine together as Palestinians as a revolutionary decolonizing activity, right? And of course, our people back home are engaged in this practice every day through various struggles and their very insistence on presence, these kind of everyday acts of survival and resistance, the invitation of the still ongoing Unity Intifada, the ways in which we love and care for each other as Palestinians cultivates this revolutionary Palestinian imaginary that is constantly performing the downfall of the Zionist regime. And I think I have just, talked for far too long. So I don't know if you want to close with another question, or if we have time.
No, I do. I just negotiated with Abir. I've been doing some work. We're supposed to be done at 8:30, and I got us 10 extra minutes because I do want to ask the last question. And I do this thing where I just really, really want people. I like to ask questions about feelings. So the last question that I'm gonna squish two questions together and infuse some feelings into it is, so this is gonna, I love doing the comparative work of how people under colonization think, and I was listening to your answers and I couldn't help analyze them as you were talking, because the question about erasure was, a question about violence. It was a question about bad things, but neither of you stuck to the bad things. You talked about the good things too. You talked about the good things about us. And I think this is a deep, deep indigenous inclination to always move beyond, just defining ourselves through the bad, defining ourselves through colonization. We've been there before, we're gonna be there after. And so the question that I have is a question, the same question that was asked to Professor Saeli at the end of her talk about the future, and kind of mix it with the question of solidarity. So, this is a panel about solidarity, and I want to hear your thoughts about what kind of solidarity. You can talk about what solidarity is already happening between us, but what is your vision for our connection moving beyond, right? And looking, and I'm going to just phrase it in this way, thinking about the future, whether you see yourself in that future or you see your children in that future, whichever generation you see, we don't have to time it. Hopefully it does happen in our lifetime, like a huge big revolution, the whole world on fire, but in a good way, I mean. But what kind of future do you see that where Palestinians and natives can exist freely? And how does solidarity how can it take us there? So what is your vision for solidarity moving beyond? And this is kind of like a message to the audience, you know, where there are people, we're all people from different places, interact with different other people, right? And so this is kind of like something that we can take with us at the end of the day. And feel free to start, Professor Warrior. I'm always
Okay,
trying to
I'll jump in.
Cool.
So
But you can also both unmute and just talk over each other if you want. Since this is the last question, everything goes.
So, well, solidarity, I think, is a really profound and beautiful thing. I think it's part of the question you haven't gotten to ask is about hope and what hope means. But I think the work of solidarity is the work of hope. It's also the work of relationships and building relationships. It's the work of seeing someone who previously seemed other, to see them as now something other than that, and to see yourself in relationship to someone else, to another person. To learn someone's personhood is to be able to learn something new about yourself as well, I think. I think that when you're wrapped up in your own struggles, I think solidarity plays a really important role in taking you out of that, so that you can see that the world is bigger, and that you can see that you don't know the end of the story, because you don't even know the fullness of where everything's happening in the world. And so, your source of hope may be coming from someplace else. It may be coming from a model that comes out of something or somewhere. And it's so easy to focus on the reasons why we should give up. But I think that solidarity, to me, is it's importantly not a matter of, it's a decision, but it has to be based on something. But it's not based on knowing everything. It's not based on even necessarily knowing everything that you want to know about somebody else's struggle. It's knowing enough to know that you want to do the right thing by standing with somebody else. And you don't know at that moment what you might be able to bring to that, other than the one thing that is always yours to offer, which is yourself, which is your body. And that if somebody's standing alone and you go stand with them, then now there are twice as many people standing there. And it's a really powerful thing to do. And you may say, gosh, there's already 1,500 people who signed on to the US ACB, endorsement of the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott of Israel. 1,500 people. Well, I'm just one more person. You could be the really important person in that. Maybe there are 5 other people that could sign on to that. And that signing something isn't necessarily solidarity. But I always like to think about solidarity as something not that I do because I know we're going to win if I stand in solidarity with somebody, but because I do it out of that sense of doing something that's right, something that's the moral thing to do, something that brings my sense of that into that larger circle. And that I'll be strengthened in the process because I'll learn so many things. But I also think the real key to that is relationships. Back to that idea that relationality is really, really crucial. And developing those relationships, out of solidarity comes new relationships with people, better, stronger relationships with people. I'm just thinking, Kaulani Kawanui is in the crowd tonight listening to us. And a really wonderful friend. But the panel you talked about being on in Austin, Texas, Kaulani was a part of the founding of the organization Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, as was I. But Kaulani played such an important role in making that organization one that would be welcoming to points of view from Palestine. And as well as from Guatemala and from other places in South America, Central America, Mexico. and that those relationships that you build with people over time are the ones that allow, you're not just drawing on somebody else's strength, you're pulling together with other people to increase your strength together. And it's not whether you win or you lose. I mean, all of us are used to losing, and we'll probably lose a bunch of these battles along the way. But we're fighting to keep fighting. And that's, you know, when you see other people fighting, it should give you hope, because that tells you that there's something worth fighting for.
Thank you so much. That was really beautiful. Professor Warrior, I don't know how I can follow that. And I, it's a hard, and just, you know, love and respect to the community who's staying here at 8:30 p.m. on a Thursday night. So I won't take up too much space. I was going to talk about, you know, a bunch of other things, but in the interest of time, I'm going to cut it short. You know, I agree with, you know, many of the things that Professor Warrior has already brought to the table. And all this to say that I think we have to approach the idea and the practice of solidarity with Native people here with a radical humility, right? And one thing that I do find resonance with is this idea of kinship, right? And Indigenous feminists have really encouraged us to think beyond the sort of heteronormative family structure, beyond biological relations, and imagining kinship. And so thinking with Professor Warrior here and talking about kind of relationality and right, these intimacies that we build with each other over time, I think also connects to this idea of solidarity, right? What would it mean to imagine ourselves as each other's kin, to reimagine kinship as forms of care? I was speaking with anthropologist Amal Bashara the other day, and she raised the term anti-colonial friendship. And I thought that was really profound. What can kin making be as a practice of solidarity, as anti-colonial friendship? How do we cultivate broader constellations of radical friendship and love and care between our communities, right? And I was really moved by the words of Professor Se Ali in another talk she gave earlier this week, where she said that it's important to understand Palestine not as a problem, but as a gift. And so I just want to, you know, use that as a way of closing out, to ask the question, right? What is it that Palestine gives us? I think part of the invitation is to consider decolonization in Palestine, you know, as really an ethical call, again, to echo, you know, these comments, to engage with Palestinian liberation as flight from these logics of racial and national and civilizational hierarchies that have constructed Palestinian life as less than human, right? As less than Israeli Jewish life, as expendable life. And the Palestinian freedom struggle, right, is an anti-racist struggle. It's an anti-imperial struggle. It's an anti-capitalist struggle, right? So decolonization requires that we recognize the interlocking nature of structures of violence, that we work toward transforming the conditions that form the basis for all interlocking forms of oppression. And part of that is to radically re-envision how we see the world. So, you know, to go along with some other comments that were made earlier, right? This is also a decolonization of our own minds and psyches, and requires new modes of imagination. It requires us to join and struggle with our you know, Native siblings here, and to envision a world that centers new modes of belonging outside the nation state form, outside of the racial, gendered, colonial violence of modernity, that dehumanizes us as a people and affirms Palestinian selfhood and life. And I wish we had time, because I'd love to hear the community kind of weigh in on this. And I don't know if y'all, you know, feel moved to do so, if you can add.
There's time for it.
Chat.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that.
Yeah, if you.
Do you want to be?
I just wanted to ask, like, if folks can tell us what they envision as solidarity between Palestinians and indigenous people of you know, Native North America, or of this land, and how do you envision decolonization, right? I don't know, maybe it's late.
We're gonna take questions, but people can definitely put it in the comments. The prompt is, what is your vision for decolonization? And in this case, decolonization has to include both of us.
Mhm.
So we're gonna have people think about it. And it's like waiting. And take a couple of questions. Abir, what do you think?
So I know we are over time, but I am also very much enjoying this this
Yeah.
conversation. I saw two questions in the chat that I'm kind of gonna combine into one, and then I think we'll end it there. And I do want to respect people's time. I do want to thank everyone for staying over, but like I love these conversations. I'm going to be emailing all three of you personally to keep these going. There is what I do want to end with, and I think what the community is asking, both Amu Fahid and James Parker, we're kind of asking about how do we, what any advice that you have of continuing to educate our communities, and as Palestinian intellectuals, how can we move beyond explaining. The question is, how can we move beyond explaining the action of the colonial settlers into the realm of creating our own narrative that is totally cut off from Zionist repression? And Amma Fahid's question was also similarly, what is the best way for us as Palestinian Americans to help our community hear our story and history? So it's this kind of similar theme of how do we tell our story and history, and really goes off of Dr. Sekeli's session very well too. So maybe we'll just close there and then we'll wrap up. And I promise for everyone who's on, we'll wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
Absolutely. These are great questions, important questions. And there's not one answer to these questions, right? There are a multiplicity of answers. I think one way that I'm working toward this in collectivity with Professor Ghanayem and with Abir and with Sara, who I see, and Professor Saeali and others who I see in the chat, is really building a political and intellectual community around feminism, around Palestinian feminism, a community of care and love that is uplifting each other. As Dr. Saeali said earlier, the Palestinian Feminist Collective that is working to confront head on some of these kind of Orientalist, racist imaginations of Palestinian women. And to take on kind of the surveillance and the criminalization of our speech as Palestinians here in the United States, that is working to center and anchor kind of a new vision for Palestinian liberation in feminism, right? In a feminist imaginary, in conversation with our sisters in the homeland who are struggling around some of these issues. And so I think for me, each of us has a role to play depending on where we're situated, right? For me, as a Palestinian Chicana scholar, part of that role is in the university, right? Part of that role is in the way that I teach, is in the way that I interact and engage with my students, is in the scholarship that I produce, right? Which is based largely on, this idea of telling our own narratives and kind of uplifting the voices of our people, right? And part of it is, as a mother, right? As a Palestinian mama, how do I teach my children our history and kind of maintain that as another element of kind of this everyday social praxis of being Palestinian and asserting Palestinian identity, right? So I think each of us, wherever we're located, has a role to play in the ongoing struggle for liberation. And I don't know, did I answer the question? Was there another question here about something else? I'm forgetting.
I think
I
think you answered them.
Yeah, I think you answered it.
Yeah.
Right.
I would jump in there and follow up on that, which I think is just said beautifully, with one more thing, which is that you don't have to wait for a moment when solidarity is needed in a really tough situation to start building those relationships. If those relationships already exist when that moment comes along, then things are a lot easier. And it's sometimes easier to build relationships and get to know somebody not in that moment of crisis, but in a time when you have a little bit more time to get to know each other and to hear longer stories and to I felt like I have to say I fell in love with those friends that I made in Ramla, because just very quickly, because I felt this connection. I felt a connection to everybody they introduced me to. I felt a familiarity with the hospitality, with the sense of just loving being there, and that wasn't solidarity at all. That was just building a relationship with really amazing people who shared their lives, and what they were going through in a way that I never could have experienced without getting to know people personally. But getting into those sorts of situations, and then when those times do come along, then you hope who's going to have your back. And I got to say this about Palestinian people, once you become friends and you're there with somebody, and even when you're not their friend, if they show up to fight, and that's really good, because if you show up to a fight not ready to fight, you shouldn't have shown up. And I've just always really appreciated that about the Palestinian people I've been in solidarity with on various things, that there's a real clear-eyed idea that there's time to fight. I guess the tiny little last thing I would say is, you do have to, after, even though sometimes you make up your mind in that moment that I know enough, once that moment is passed and the crisis is over and hopefully you've won, it's time to go back and kind of learn more, right? To say, okay, maybe there's more going on here that I know, that I need to know more about all of this, and to see what are the critical issues that are going on in someone else's community. How can I support it? How can I help make their community better by my own participation in friendships with people and getting to know people, becoming a trustworthy friend. And thanks to Sarah and to Iman for everything you've done tonight. It's really great.
I was going to say thank you both so much. These answers were so insightful and profound and filled with a lot of things that people quoted. I was also going to say that in the spirit of radical friendship, we're all friends today. And so feel free to get in touch with our speakers if you have any questions to them. I'm like volunteering you, sorry. I was also going to say, Professor Warrior, Dr. Mahmoud is from Tormasaya, which is a town in Ramallah. So you're going full circle here. I like when destiny does that kind of stuff. But thank you all so much. I'm going to hand it off to Abir to say final goodbyes.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Naim, for moderating this and still doing this and coming up with questions, even though you were sick. I think, and thank you all for staying over time. But I think that just speaks to how great and awesome this conversation was. And there's never enough time for these conversations, but hopefully we stay in touch and we stay in contact. And I just want to thank the three of you for such an important and just profound conversation. I'm going to end us for the day by thanking another one of our sponsors. We really want to thank the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace for sponsoring our conference. They work to educate Christian churches, organizations, and individuals about what's happening in Palestine, and encourages and supports their advocacy for Palestinian rights in the US and beyond. Please check them out. They do such great work, and we're really grateful for them for sponsoring our conference. That is all we had planned for today. We do have another fun trivia. So check the chat. I think Liadi is about to put the trivia document in the chat. Check the chat for that Google form if you want a chance to win one of our awesome free shirts that our amazing graphic designer, Fadia Al-Agha. I want to give credit to artists because they never get enough credit for making our awesome shirts that tie into the theme of the conference. If you want to win one, please fill that out. If you'd like to just purchase one, it's also available online. But with that, I want to thank you all for such a great opening day. We couldn't have had better speakers and panelists to start off our day. Thank you all for joining us late on a Thursday night. We hope to see you tomorrow on Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern for another awesome day. I gave a little sneak peek, but we will be hearing from Mariam Barghouti, and we're going to have a solidarity panel with Greg Burris, Mariam Griffin, and a local organizer, Zeli Imani, to talk about solidarity again. So we hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.